Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 267. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm joined by author Melanie Anagnos, whose debut novel, Nightswimming, drops us straight into the gritty streets of Paterson, New Jersey, circa 1979. Her story follows Jamie Palmieri, a young patrol officer barely 3 years out of the academy, who suddenly finds himself pulled into a brutal double murder investigation. What begins as a request for an extra pair of hands quickly becomes something far more dangerous as Jamie realizes the killer may be turning his sights on him. But Nightswimming isn't just a tense police procedural. It's a sharp look at the era's entrenched injustices, including the way female victims were routinely dismissed by a police force that was overwhelmingly male. Melanie describes Nightswimming as a gritty mystery that is definitely of its time. In this episode, I'll chat with Melanie about her writing journey, the challenge of getting the minutiae of 1979 Paterson exactly right, and why she once believed her shift from nonfiction essays to crime fiction was a bad idea, as well as a few other things coming up. Melanie Anagnos, thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your debut novel, Nightswimming. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
The novel is it's a mystery. It's a police procedural, and it really had an interesting origin story because it started out as an offshoot of a quiet novel that I'd been writing for a long time. And it was I think that there's always that novel that people start and think is going to be the novel, and then eventually realize, it's time to move on. And Jamie, who's the main character of Nightswimming, had been a minor character in the quiet novel. And, I just decided I wanted to try something different. And even though I'd never really thought about writing crime fiction, as his story evolved, I became very, very interested in, how police procedurals are structured, and it was just very, very interesting to put together not only the puzzle of the crime or the crime itself, but how someone would have solved it, particularly in the 1970s when there were no TV cameras or DNA.
Right. So I want to talk about two main things. The main character, and then I want to get to setting. But let's talk about Jamie in particular, because you're right. That's an interesting origin story. He existed before this book, before this story. He existed somewhere else in another story, in another world. So let's talk a little bit about him. What would be helpful for readers to know about Jamie and how he came to be?
I'm going to answer that in a lot of different directions. I do believe very much in the genre and that this is a mystery novel, but it's also a product of its time and its place in the 1970s. And I do write a lot. I've written long form essays on the changing, culture, the women's movement. And it was very interesting for me to have a character who's a young man in a very, very traditional male environment of a police station, dealing with issues about women and women's place in society. This is where women, how women were treated by the police, how crimes against women were treated by the police. So I think that, looking at Jamie as a young man and understanding his journey as a young police officer and how he was going to serve the community, it is something I think is a good lens.
Flowing from that, let's talk about setting, because I'm curious why that specific time, because in theory you could have written it at any point. Why that specific time and why that specific location?
So I will do time period first. I'm always interested. I mean, if you're going to get lost in a novel, I like being transported, different locations, different time periods. So that's something that attracts me as a reader and also as a writer, because now I'm doing research. I'm losing myself in a decade that was, 40, 50 years ago. And that's interesting to me, and I think it's interesting to readers. And I also like the 70s. I think it was a time of a lot of social unrest, political, economic. I think it was a very dynamic time, and you also had a lot of interesting things going on with punk rock and just so it's a decade that I go back to, and I find it an interesting decade. And as I said, and also writing a police procedural using the tools that would have been available then and not the tools that are available now was a challenge and something I really enjoyed. So that would take us to the 70s. In terms of the location, that was natural for me in terms of that's where I was born in Paterson. I grew up in that area. And so if I was thinking of writing a gritty mystery, that seemed just, that was the first location that would occur to me. But I do believe there's a lot about the location that as I was writing, it was very appealing. I've been asked this question before, and something that I think about is mysteries that are very often, situated in New York and Los Angeles, which are very large cities. They're very alienating, and that's really how they're depicted. They're very specifically set up as these, very cold environments, and people are lost in the city. Whereas I think Paterson, even though it's a city, it was a very small city, and there was an intimacy that appealed to me for my characters.
Well, let's talk about that pre-digital environment, because you mentioned it was a bit of a challenge. Like, solving a crime during that time period had its challenges that some of today's technology solves those challenges. But I'm curious, for a writer, what are the pros and cons of setting a novel in the time before information was easily accessible, and it came quickly, and it was far reaching? So what, good or bad to have chosen the time period you chose now that you're on the other side of the story?
Well, now that I'm on the other side of the story, I think it was great and it was fun for me and I solved the puzzle. But, it was really challenging, particularly because if you're writing, a close third person where you're really only in the head of one character, so you're not getting information that would not have been accessible to him. Yeah, it was a challenge, but police officers did solve those crimes. And one of the things that I did as research is I listened to a lot of podcasts featuring police officers, and they were not necessarily true crime oriented, more, these were, podcasts where police officers were the hosts and they would invite other, detectives on and they would talk about their cases and how they solved them. So I thought about, what was available and, taking pieces from, cases in the newspaper. I went to newspaper.com. How did these things get solved years ago? A shirt that was found at the scene of the crime and there was a laundry stamp on it. Things that would not have occurred to me. But, there were ways that police officers, did their work, and, focusing on that minutia was important.
You mentioned something earlier about choosing the setting that you chose. It wasn't a big city. We think of sort of these police procedurals, as you mentioned, as occurring in these big cities. And the genre kind of bumps up against that noir feel. So when we're talking about gritty location and a police investigation, I think a lot of people harken back to sort of the traditional noir kind of or old time police detective stories, where there is generally a damsel in distress. Now, she may be a dangerous person in her own right, but still she requires some sort of rescuing. Now, setting your novel in the 70s, where discussions of women's rights and treatment of women was sort of forefront. How did you make decisions about the women in the stories, how they would be treated, and what people would expect versus maybe what you wanted to have happen?
One of the things that I did think about was the critiques that crime fiction, victimizes women. But on the other hand, that's just statistically true. So I'd been reading Robert Kolker had written a book about I always pronounce this wrong, the Giglo Beach murders. And it was really geared towards personalizing all of those victims. So that was very impactful to me to really, sort of get that permission that you can write about these crimes as long as you're doing it in a very thoughtful way. So that, there was that aspect. And also, because this is historical fiction, even though 30, 40 years ago, we think about, well, how powerful the women's movement was, but it really, it hadn't really permeated, everyday life. So, there was only a certain amount of agency. And that was something I really struggled with, was being honest to the time period, but also readers today that, would want characters with agency.
Right. And that's a tricky bit, right? If they wouldn't have had agency in reality in that time period, but today's readers expect that there will be some. There's a bit of tension, how to be true to the time and yet also keep readers wanting to keep reading.
Right. You don't want to turn off, a reader because, somebody who's reading today, does have certain expectations and, you have to value what your reader is looking for.
Right. Right. How much research did you need to do for this book? Apart from, so it sounds like there was several types of research. One, just how do police solve crimes? One, and then how do they solve it in that time period with the resources that they had? But also the setting. How different was Paterson in the 70s versus what you see today? How much research did you have to do? How long did that take you? And was it something you did up front or on a continuing basis as you were writing?
All of it. Yes. So I did research up front just to have like a basic working knowledge of how, how the police work so I could even begin the novel. And, I went back, newspaper.com was really helpful just to read about, the kinds of crimes that were going on at the time and just getting information, looking what stores were selling, how much things were selling for, just the kind of technology that people had in their homes, all of that, looking at old, I love Columbo, looking at old episodes and seeing what was available. So there was that, and I happen to love research, so for me it was that was just like the bonus, is that to constantly go back and look at photographs of Paterson in the 1970s and then reviewing what I had written and comparing it to, something else I had learned about police and guns and different types of guns. So yeah, I mean, there was a lot of research and it was ongoing, but it just was so interesting to me because again, I'm immersing myself in something I don't know anything about. And I just find that to be, one of the great things about writing.
Yeah. When I've interviewed authors who write historical fiction, many of them tell me that the problem they run into is not being able to find the information they need, but to stop themselves from continuing to research and finally just writing or getting back to the writing. That it's very easy to go down rabbit holes when you start researching for your stories. Did you find that? Did you find yourself forcing yourself back to the story and away from the research?
Yes, I mean, I really enjoyed the story, so it was fun to go back into it. But yes, I probably, I'm not self-reflective enough to know how much time I spent doing research just for the sake of doing research. But that was probably true. That was, yeah, I could see myself doing that.
Well, can you give us a little insight into the title? Because I'm curious. One, its meaning, and two, at what point did the title come to you?
So Night Swimming is a song by REM, and I remember listening to it before I had a title for the book, and it just sort of was one of those moments that I was like, oh yeah, I think this is a great, imagery for what I'm doing, because it's a crime with not a lot of clues. So somebody's sort of in that dark evening or and in the water and you're not really sure-footed. So I thought the imagery worked well for what I was trying to get across in the novel.
Did you stumble upon it before you started writing, or when it was done, or at what point?
I think it was in the process.
Okay. Okay. Did you know the end when you started writing?
I did. I knew the beginning and I knew the end. And, so whether I'm a plotter, I don't write I don't have like a specific plot that I write out, but I definitely knew the end. And as I, as I was writing, then I would, you know, plot it afterwards, to see what was working, what scenes needed to be moved. But yeah, I think for the novel I'm working on now, I also know the end.
Do you write, do you tend to write linearly? Do you start at the beginning and write each scene, or do you kind of jump around? Some authors sort of Frankenstein their novels. They write whatever scene feels strongest in the moment.
I will write in a linear fashion most of the time, but sometimes I will want to write a scene, so I'll put a placeholder in, as I'm going, to come back and describe what the scene should be, and then get to something that's really interesting to me at that time.
How about editing? What are your thoughts on the editing process? Fan or not?
Fan.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. Because that's where you go back and you make your sentences really work and you tie together a couple of paragraphs that are sort of clunky and you can do really, to me, that's when I'm doing my best work.
I'm always curious how many drafts people go through, how many rounds. Some people write an extremely rough first draft, and it's 10 drafts, 10 iterations before they get to the point where they're happy with it. Sometimes, even more than that. Other people tend to write a fairly clean first draft because they're kind of editing as they're going along. Where do you fall on that spectrum, do you think?
I think I have a decent first draft. It's not, you know, not as rough a draft as, I in the past I've done some really rough drafts. I mean, so it's decent, but it's certainly not, really clean. And then I go through it for a lot of different, reasons. I'll go through it for the language. I'll go through it for the story. Again, moving a scene. And, I think for each of the types of editing that I do, I'll do a few what I call passes on it. Some people know exactly what they're doing, like, oh, I do 10 edits or I do 5 edits or whatever. I do a decent amount of editing because I'm doing editing for different reasons, and each of those is quite a few.
And now that book one is done, what are your plans for the series? Do you know, say, the mystery for book two? Do you know how many books you want to write in total? Do you have kind of plans for the series, or was it initially just get this one done and then we'll see what happens?
Well, initially I hadn't, because I'd never really thought about writing crime fictions. This was new. I didn't think of it as a series when I was writing it. And, I think one of the things that happens, as a reader because I've been reading more crime fiction and reading more series, and you become very, very attached to the characters as a reader. So as a writer, I don't think I'm ready to say it's going to be X amount of you know, novels in the series because I'm not sure when I'd be ready to let go.
Now, is writing something you have always wanted to do? Were you a writer as a young person, or is writing something you've come to later in life?
Well, I was a daydreamer as a young person.
Mm.
So I didn't, some people were like, oh, I wrote a story when I was in junior high school. I was like, no, I didn't do that, but I daydreamed a lot. And yeah, I always wanted to write a book. And I think, when I seriously started thinking about my MFA, which was later in life, then I did think about, I wanted to take my writing to another level and see what I could, put out into the world.
This is your debut novel. Have you, and you mentioned you had been working on that quiet novel earlier. How has that writing journey progressed for you? You mentioned an MFA later in life, but I assume you've maybe tried your hands at different formats, different forms of writing, different at this point, dabbled in different genres. Do you think you found a voice yet, or is that still an ongoing effort?
I do. I've done a lot of essay writing in the past 2, 3 years because I have a Substack, and that was a really interesting journey for me as a writer because in nonfiction, in an essay, I really never felt that I found my voice. And writing that, in that format and writing, producing articles on Substack, I really do feel very comfortable and in a way that I did not think I would. So
Just
I think, for me, I needed to get to a point, in my fiction and in my essay writing where I was doing it enough that all of a sudden, you feel that comfort in what you're doing and that confidence that, yeah, this is the way I like to approach it. This is how I want to sound on the page.
so when you made that pivot to the police procedural, was that a comfortable, natural transition, or were there still some nerves involved when
Oh
you
no,
decided?
I don't remember exactly when I said, "Oh yes, I'm going to do a police procedural," but I remember thinking like the idea was sort of, like taking life in my brain that this is the worst idea ever. Like this, I know nothing about writing a police procedural. Like this is just such a bad idea. But I do feel like pushing yourself out of your comfort zone is a really good thing to do as a writer. And even though I, had, a different type of writing in my past, which was these quiet kind of novels and short stories, that it was, a genre that I have a lot of respect for, and I wanted to try.
So now that you've done it, and I assume you'll have ideas for others, are there other goals that you have as a writer, or is it really just to write the next one?
I think right now it's to write the next one, and maybe have different stories evolve and see try to do something else maybe down the road. But right now, I think I really enjoy Jamie as a character, and I enjoy the setting of Paterson very much. And I do have the outlet of my Substack, and it keeps me busy and it keeps me very engaged as a writer. And I get to do all of that research, like all those the rabbit holes, like that has not stopped.
Oh, really?
Yes, it has not stopped.
So it sounds like that's something that's going to accompany you throughout this series.
I think it will.
Yeah. The rest of the series, is your plan for it that the mysteries in each one will be solved? So each book technically stands alone, but I assume since it's a series, there's a character arc through you follow the characters as they grow series, or
Very much. Yes,
Okay.
it's standalone. I think there's a lot of series, the series that I read, they were all standalone novels, and you could just pick it up. And sometimes, if I'm reading a series, I don't know, always go in order. I'll read a book, and then I'll read a book, the one that came, two books prior, and it's just fine.
Right, right. I'm curious, since this is your debut novel, and you've written in other genres, but this is the first one in novel form that you're putting out there. I'm curious what you found to be the biggest surprise on on this journey. Something you didn't think about or realize until here you are.
Well, I think the media coverage was for me a big surprise. You know, um, I don't. I was working with a small publishing house, and when I was picked up by the New York Times, that was like not something I expected. The review in Kirkus, those were really, wonderful, affirmations of what I was trying to do, and I was very, very surprised by that.
How does that affect what you do next, do you think? Did you when those came in, was there ever a moment where you thought, okay, is what I'm planning next going to work in light of the reception the first book received?
Well, I think there's always that fear about, the second novel or, whatever, if you're an artist, the second album, can you do it again? Can you do it as well? But I think that that's a pressure that's good. That's a good pressure for a writer to feel like I need to always be aware of what I'm writing and always pushing myself.
Are you at work on book two?
Yes, I'm working on book two and thinking about book three, and I'm getting back to my Substack and writing those articles. So yes, I'm working full time on my
Yeah.
writing.
Yeah. So no rest for the weary.
No, no.
Good. All right. Well, if people want to learn more about you and the book and say look for the new release when it's ready, where should they go to find you, follow you, discover that information?
So I do have a website, which is my name, melanieanagnos.com, keeping it easy. My Substack is called Cherchez la Femme. And yeah, I guess you could put that in the show notes because, I'm pronouncing the French. And let's see. And those are basically the social media platforms that I'm most active on.
Good. And if people want to purchase a copy of Night Swimming, where should they go to buy it?
You can get it Amazon, of course, Barnes and Noble, Bookshop.org. And I think those the basic places that have mainstream distribution.
Good. Well, Melanie, thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you the best of luck with Night Swimming and book number two, which we will look forward to. So, congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you again for inviting me.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the bookshop at the end of the internet.